Good morning, everybody. The year is 1983, and it is a new economy. Silicon subverts our smokestacks as the information age nudges out the industrial with the self-assured inevitability of history. Just look at Apple. 6 years from garage to Fortune 500, it's never been done. It's a new
era. It's a neoliberal era, exacerbating a flawed system as we chase short-term growth on borrowed money. Quantitative easing, austerity, administrations eroding the public trust as we flail foolishly, shorting our future on shoddy Chicago doctrine.
It is 1998, and it is a new economy. The dot-com decade, a new economic renaissance, liberating ideas and products to flow freely through a web the world wide. Just look at WorldCom. Value is being captured out of thin air.
A bubble's deflation. The hubris expectation exaggerating entrepreneurs as the panacea that will rewrite economic rules.
It is 2007, and it is a new economy. Version 1.0 had its growing pains. Version 2 will be a revolution. Open sourced and wikied, we're connecting the sum of human knowledge and accessing it through the supercomputers in our pockets. The dot-com reclaimed, a flat world where individuals possess the power to shape the future. Facebook, started by 3 friends in a dorm room, now 100 million connected internationally. Startups are the titans of the new
economy. It's the worst recession since the Great Depression, leaving another generation marooned on a crippled job market. Facebook is no new economy. It's the same corporations, though the CEOs are in flip-flops, they're selling us ourselves.
It is 2015, and it is a new economy. Social entrepreneurship permeates purpose across organizations. Aligning profit with world's challenges, there are new leaders from community bulletins to a $100 billion sharing economy, a hack lab to the energy grid of the entire country. The rules are being rewritten, and we ain't seen nothing
yet. Yet inequality soars, the climate trembles, and history continues to trundle along in the wrong direction. If it is a new economy, what has actually changed?
Marcia McLuhan suggested that artists were the distant early warning sign, referencing Cold War terminology, suggesting that artists could see what others could not. And so the purpose of the Artists' Roundtable is to bring artists and other practitioners together into dialogue, into question the deeply misunderstood paradigm at the heart of each successive version of the new economy.
And so today, through the artist's eyes, the panel will examine the psychological and cultural experience of the new economy. They will ask not only what it means to be an economic entity in the new economy, but more importantly, what it could mean. Thank you. So just a couple of notes on today, onto the room. Thank you for bearing with us with that experiment in an introduction. It was a lot of fun. So a couple of notes on the day. Thank you for coming. We're going to be here for until about 11 o'clock. There is food. It's down the hallway if no one's got it. There'll be an opportunity at the tail end to grab some food and chat with folks. The washrooms are down the end of the hallway, and I think that's all the housekeeping items. So we have an esteemed panel today that we are really excited to have all together in one place and to discuss this very interesting and very challenging topic. But before we do, I want to make a note that recognizes that today we're going to talk about a history of new economies that is only a mere glimpse of the vast history of human economies that have existed across time and across space in the world. And while much of the explorations today will be grounded from a Western worldview that many of us come from in this room, it is very important to recognize that this Western point of departure is not the only point of departure, and that there are many forms of economies that we can't even imagine. So what we explore is only merely one possibility. Probably the most obvious in front of us is that this land in Vancouver and this land in British Columbia and this land across Canada resides on unceded Indigenous territory. And there's a long history since time immemorial of economies being built here. So as we project forward towards the new economy, it's prudent and wise to look back at other forms of economies that transcend just our Western worldview. Yeah.
So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel briefly, and then our artist, Marilou Lemmens. So we have with us Todd Lester, Matt Hearn, Cédric Jamais, and Marilou Lemmens. And I'll read her bio, and she'll tell you a little bit more about her practice. So Marilou Lemmens is a visual artist based in Durham Sud and Montreal, Quebec, where she works in collaboration with Richard Ibghy. Spanning various media, including video, performance, and installation, their work explores the material, effective in sensory dimensions of experience that cannot be fully translated into signs or systems. For several years, they have examined the rationale upon which economic actions are described and represented, and how the logic of economy has come to infiltrate the most intimate aspects of life. Their work has been shown nationally and internationally, including La Biennale de Montréal, the Images Festival in Toronto, Filture, Scene Nationale, Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow, and the Biennale in the UAE, among others. Marilou, over to you.
I think I'll be moving over there so that I can control the computer. So, can you hear me? It's good? Okay. Well, first, maybe I'll move a little bit to this side. Well, I wanted to thank Scott Baker and Russ Kurtner for inviting me to present here, and of course for all of you who are in the audience, and for the co-panelists who are here as well, and which I'm looking forward to have a discussion with, including the audience and the panelists. So over the past few years, about 10 years, my collaborative practice with Richard Ibghy has explored a number of issues which are related to recent processes of economic, social, and political transformation. These transformations have altered social relations, the organization of labor, and produced new forms of subjectivities. Their effects also include the dematerialization and depoliticization of economy. So today I'm going to present to you 4 projects which engage with these questions in different ways. There are, just to give you a quick idea, 3 main modes of operations that are happening in these projects and interconnected. One of them is the materialization of abstraction. Another one is creating practical experiments in which we work mostly with improvised actions, and these experiments take place in kind of workshop-like situations. And the third mode of operation is working at the level of the imaginary, so imagining other possibilities, and that is done especially through speculative fictions. The prevalence of abstraction in the graphical language of economy is something that Richard and I are attracted to, and that comes up often in our work. Part of the interest is epistemological and deals with the increasing use of statistics and mathematics in all areas of knowledge. But more importantly, our interest is due to the weight and authority that this language is able to enjoy in public discourse. Today, economic rationality has invaded intellectual, affective, and material territories that were previously deemed outside of its realm. It has not only expanded its scope of inquiry, but also extended its sphere of influence. Our artistic practice often involves taking economic discourse from its lofty position and bringing it down to earth, we could say, through processes of profanations. And I could go back eventually to what I mean by profanations. Amongst ourselves, we refer to this process as bringing abstract space to materiality. Part of our engagement as artists has been to rematerialize or to demythologize abstractions and abstract thought, especially with regard to the economy. Much of this work deals with the language and aesthetics of economics as a formalization of neoliberal rationality. So the piece that you're seeing now is called The Prophets. It's a work that we started in 2013 for an exhibition at the Henny Unstad Kunst Center in Norway. And at the time, the piece comprised about 100 models. We continued working on this piece, and for the Biennale de Montréal, we presented in 2014 a version that included about 400 models. And the piece is ongoing, so it's still growing. I think it's about 500 now. So the sculptures in this piece constitute a diagrammatology of the visual language used in economic science. The models that are included date from the beginning of the use of diagrams in political economy in the 18th century and go all the way to today. As you can see, they are all very small. They're made by hand. They're made with very ordinary materials, bamboo skewers, kind of barbecue sticks, acetate, thread, things like that, things you find in the kitchen or in the house. Each one is accompanied by a title written by hand, and this title anchors these forms that could be abstract sculptures when you see them in an art museum into this language of economic thinking and a special kind of form of thought. So there's this mixture in these models of a way to think and a form that is completely imbricated, that you can't separate. And one of the things that we wanted to do by working with this form was, for one thing, taking it out from the two-dimensionality where we usually see it on screens or on paper, and bringing it to a 3D space where the viewers can have an embodied experience, a physical experience of these things as small, constructed representations, and also spaces of testing hypotheses. And of course, by doing it the way we did them, by making them by hand, and by making them with the kinds of materials that we use, they could never reach the kind of perfection that gives its authority to this language. Other projects that I've realized with Richard Ibghy have examined the issue of labor in a knowledge-based economy from the standpoint of the internalization of neoliberal rationality. They explore what it could mean to resist the pressure which incites us to be productive, not only at work, but in every aspect of our lives. So this piece, Real Failure Needs No Excuse, was realized in an empty office building in Glasgow in 2012. And it's a single-channel video, which lasts about 23 minutes. And I'm going to show you a short extract. It's 2 minutes. Okay, so as you can see, the building was empty except for me doing these actions in there. It's a building in which everything, the interior architectures, the objects, the space were designed to maximize efficiency. And the question we asked ourselves when we started working there was, how can we act in a place like this in a non-instrumental way? So for this purpose, we designed a kind of action that we called non-goal-oriented action, which is the idea of engaging with things, with ourselves, and with spaces in a way that is not instrumental, that is not functional or leading to a predetermined purpose. This also meant for us trying to go beyond the idea of success and failure, which is actually harder than I expected. It's a challenge to accept failure and to accept that things don't work and to get in a different mode of thinking. So it's also working in a way on ourselves, and when we do these kind of improvised actions, to try to see if we can think differently and act differently and react to things differently. So in this case, it also meant that precisely executed actions could be undertaken without any idea of what it would mean for them to be successful. So trying to remove this whole framework of thinking. Because we were primarily concerned with engaging with uncertainty, so not controlling everything, we work with improvised actions, which is something that we returned to in several other projects afterwards, instead of working with scripted performance or repetitive tasks, for example. The other thing that we especially like about working in this way is the fact that improvised actions always demand a kind of practical intelligence, which brings the corporal and the mental or the cognitive together. So it permits to link in one movement body and thought. I'll just show you a couple stills from the video. Oops, going a bit fast. Okay, the next project I'll present to you is called Is There Anything Left to Be Done at All? As actors involved in the sphere of art, we've also been thinking about the specific characteristics of our field of work. And in particular, we've been thinking about how artistic labor, with the changes in the economy and changes in technologies, does not really represent anymore a space of unalienated labor, so a kind of space outside of the conditions of work in general that would be predominant. But in many ways, artistic labor has come to epitomize many of the characteristics of current forms of labor, so 21st century creative labor, including self-motivation, competition, flexibility, and precarity. So in the spring last year, in 2014, we were invited to do a 3 weeks production-based residency at Trinity Square Video in the context of Images Festival in Toronto. And given that the residency was dedicated to art production, well, we asked ourselves, how can we act, or how can we embrace the non-productive in artistic practice without depriving ourselves of our capacity to act? So it was kind of starting with a difficult question and entering in a kind of contradictory or confrontational position with the aim of the residency, which was also to lead to an exhibition. So the question for us was not only how the capacity for creativity, play, and engagement may be unharnessed from economic valorization, but what it could mean to put serious effort into something which has no finality. After breaking the links that bind intention with realization, effort with reward, we wanted to explore what, if anything, there was left to be done. Hence the title, Is There Anything Left to Be Done at All? So to explore this question, we invited 4 artists to come and spend some time with us during the residency and to workshop the potential of unproductive labor. One of these artists is here today in the audience, Justine Chambers, who's right there under the green balloon, I think. And she's a dancer and choreographer based in Vancouver. So based on our explorations with these 4 artists, some of them conducted their explorations by themselves very independently. Some of them we worked all together, as you'll see. So based on these explorations, we created an installation in which we presented traces of what happened during the residency. And these include 5 video channels, as well as cultural elements that were all inspired by what happened during the residency. So the actions were presented in the same space that they were filmed, in this white room and now in this black room. And one of the interesting things is, although each of the artists came by themselves to work with us, and so they had time on their own, in the end, by putting all these actions in the same room at the same time, there was a kind of chaos of sounds that mingle. So you had the activities of one person with the other person, and somebody laughing in a corner, and somebody making music or sounds in another corner, and there was a kind of ecology of things happening, or some kind of ecosystem. It's very sensual, that won't really be conveyed here with the stills. Now I'll show you 2 short extracts of what we presented in terms of video. And this one is something that we filmed with Justine Chambers. And I'll show you a short extract of what we filmed with Kevin Rogers. Oops, I think I just skipped it. The last piece I'm going to present to you is called the Golden USB. It's a project that we started last year as a commission from the Biennale de Montréal, L'Avenir Looking Forward, and it's also a project that's ongoing. So the Golden USB is a trade capsule, and the aim is to promote interstellar trade. The trade capsule is housed in a gold USB flash memory device, and it's intended to travel aboard a probe headed towards the stars beyond our solar system. So, as some of you may guess, the Golden USB is a sequel or a follow-up to the Golden Record, which was a project developed by Carl Sagan and NASA in 1977. and which aim to introduce extraterrestrials to human culture. So when we prepared this project, we started by asking ourselves what separated us from that time and what could characterize our time if we were to take up such an initiative today. And what we came up with was the idea that our time was an epidemic of commodities. So it is a time where a slab of granite, a patented seed, a human emotion, a gene, a computer-generated image, a bond option, a musical sample, a trademark name, and a Facebook postings are all comparable things. There appears to be no limits to the logic of commodification, as it extends its reach to ever newer territories. So to put together the capsule, we prepared a list of everything on Earth that might be of interest to aliens, and we called it the trade catalog of everything. So the trade catalog is organized into 5 main sections, and each of these categories is then further organized into subcategories, divisions, classes, subclasses, and so on, until every form of life, everything, every idea, and everything else is included. So the piece takes the form of an installation. It includes a selection of videos and material samples, as well as audio samples taken from the trade catalog of everything. And the video material in this piece, at this point, lasts about 7 or 8 hours. So I'll show you just quickly a couple extracts. But first I'll finish showing you the installation as it was presented at Vox in Montreal in 2014. So in this room, what we see is a smaller kind of section where the golden USB is shown. It's actually a fully functional golden USB key with the trade catalog of everything recorded on it, and we could change it eventually when it grows as well. And at the bottom you see these papers that explain the mission, the division or the organization of the catalog, as well as a floor plan where each item presented in the exhibition is actually located within the trade catalog of everything. So I'll show you 2 short video clips. So one of the things that we explored in the videos was the gestures of appropriation. And we looked at the gesture of taking or grabbing or ripping something from a very complex environment and then presenting it or displaying it, offering it. And I'll just show you a little bit of this last video. This video was cataloged under the sub category of human know-how unpatented. Oops. just to finish, this idea of an interstellar trade for us was the logical extension of the economic paradigm of a planet without boundaries or borders. So in other words, of global capitalism. And we just try to imagine what could it be if we went from this closed system of one planet to a very open system. And in fact, what that brought us to do was not to look very far away, but actually to look all around us and to see what was there. So we started with things that are in the countryside next to where we live. We started what was in our drawers and in our cupboards, and just looking at this material world and this world also of idea, this immaterial world that we live in. So thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Marilou. So now we're going to move in and hear a slightly shorter presentation from our three other panelists here. And then we'll have a brief discussion, and then we're going to open it up to the whole room. So to the panel, we've got, the three of you have about 20 minutes shared till we need to provide some room for questions. So please allocate accordingly. Yeah, and we'll give you a microphone just so that it does show up in the video recording so that folks can check it out later. So our next panelist is Matt Hearn. So I met Matt, I actually met Matt a couple of years ago in a dark room in East Van. I had borrowed my dad's old film camera. I thought it looked pretty cool. I got to go around and look like a hipster as I took photos. And then I had to develop this film, and I had no idea how. And London Drugs didn't develop this black and white film anymore. So I was searching for a place that I could actually learn how to do this, and I stumbled across the Purple Thistle. And I walked in the doors of the Purple Thistle and asked, I hear you guys have a dark room here. May I use it, or can I rent it? I think I asked. And they said, sure. They let me in. They basically gave me the run of the joint, asked us if you have any questions, and they basically just let me have at it. At the end, I asked, like, what are the rates? How much does this cost? And they said, well, we actually don't really work on rates like that. If you can, afford to contribute some supplies or some money, feel free, but it's not an expectation. And I gave some cash later on, but I was absolutely perplexed because it was not an experience that I had had before and not an experience that I had anticipated, and I was extremely thrilled by it. Like, I was excited by the notion that I could have free reign of this resource that was unregulated in a sense and was built kind of by a bound of trust. So that's how I came across Matt Hearn. And he's gone on to kind of push the limits and break the expectations in a number of manners. He's pretty well known around town. He's a teacher at UBC, a community organizer, a writer, and an activist. He's experimented in radical urbanism, community development, and alternative forms of education. You may know him by his work in the Purple Thistle, as I do, where he was a founder. But he was also the founder of Car Free Vancouver Day, Groundswell, the grassroots economic alternatives. So with that, I'll pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, that's very kind of you. So a couple of things. Thanks, Ross and Scott, for inviting me, and thanks to you guys for showing up this morning at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Friday. And I would like to say before starting that to acknowledge that we're on unceded Coast Salish territory here. So this is the unceded, the traditional and the occupied territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Stolo people. And the fact that we're here today and that we're all gathered on unceded land is a huge testament to their generosity and kindness in hosting us here. So thanks. And I'd like to say just a couple of quick things that maybe I can kind of work back to some of Marilou's work a little bit, which is to say that for many years now, for a couple of decades, I guess, in Vancouver, here I've been working and thinking about what I guess much of my work, I guess, could be thought of as thinking about new economic forms. I tend to describe much of my work as within a social or solidarity economic framework, and to rethink the way we talk about value. And I am increasingly I'm increasingly unconvinced that I have the language tools at hand to talk and to think and to act in new ways. I am a huge part of my training, my academic training, is in classical economics. And in many ways, I find traditional neoclassical economic rationalities infringing in my everyday thinking in all kinds of ways. In ways that I'm surprised, in ways that I'm constantly trying to root out of myself in some ways, and then find themselves showing up in other kinds of forms. So when I was watching that, watching some of Marilou's work there, I was thinking the regard to which the ideas, for example, of productivity are implicated in every single one of my activities, and the idea of success and failure, and how I constantly try to frame those in particular. I keep finding new ways that old logics are inscribed in my thinking, and I remain tremendously unconvinced that I know how to think outside myself. And let me give you a couple of, or let me give you just at least one quick example here, to thinking about the classical, the paradigmatic measure of classical economic thinking, of neoliberal thinking today, in particular, is the idea of the GDP. The gross domestic product is the preeminent economic measure of our time, and has been since the late 30s. It was the GDP was a project coming out of the Depression, and really took off after World War II, but was a project of a guy called Simon Kuznets, who was often described as the most boring economist alive, and I think he often took that as a compliment, who was attempted to categorize and to measure every kind of productive activity in the United States happening in the 30s and 40s. And it was a very particular measure for very particular reasons. In part, a Rooseveltian project to try to understand what exactly was happening, because people could see around them that there was a depression. People could see that there was poverty and want and inequality. And then coming out of World War II, people could see that there were certain kinds of productivities. But the project of the GDP was attempting to measure it. And it was a very particular kind of measurement and a very particular kind of project. If someone came to you and said, okay, I'd like you to measure every kind of productive activity in the country, Kuznets proceeded in many of the same ways we might proceed. He started measuring stuff. He started measuring quantifiable stuff. And in the last 6 decades, the idea of the GDP has expanded far, far beyond its original intention and has become the touchstone for economic thinking everywhere. If we were to ask, as a region, as a country, as a city, as a place, wealthy or is it poor, the first place people overwhelmingly refer to is the GDP. But it's a very simple measure, and Kuznets acknowledged almost right out of the box that it was an inadequate measure for all kinds of reasons. The GDP measures extraordinarily simple set of activities. It measures consumptive expenditure, plus government expenditure, plus investment, plus net imports or exports. It's a very simple series of adding. It's adding 4 things together and coming up with a nice, tidy, rounded number by which you can ask yourself, is Burkina Faso richer or poorer than Switzerland? And you can get an answer very quickly. The problem with the GDP, of course, is that not only does it leave out a tremendous amount. So the first thing about the GDP that people note is that it leaves out a huge amount of human activity. So any kind of activity that is non-monetizable, anything that does not pass through the market, just simply doesn't count. So for example, if I were to take care of my children for the morning, that does not get recorded on any economic ledgers. If, however, I was to pay somebody to take care of my children, then that becomes a productive, monetizable, calculable, measurable activity, and that contributes to the economy. If, for example, one of us were to keep one of our grandparents at home and take care of them, that is not considered an economic activity. Farming them out to some other kind of caregiver is an economic activity, despite there being no difference in productivity. So the way we measure economic activity, what we call economics, leaves out, in fact, the vast majority of human activity. Everything that does not pass through the market simply doesn't count in our renditions of economics. More than that, though, the GDP, which is really the core rationality of what we call economics, has no capacity to minus. It doesn't take away things. So, for example, the GDP does not count debt. Given GDP rationalities, if I was to go out and get a credit card and buy a whole bunch of stuff, that would be an immensely productive activity for the economy, because what would be measured, in fact, would be all my activity in the marketplace, buying stuff. The debt doesn't count. But more importantly, what really doesn't count is an ecological debt, so that the GDP is not able to measure or to account for ecological devastation. So that, for example, any kind of economic activity, like let's say an extractive economy activity, like let's say a mine, gets counted in terms of economic multipliers, it gets counted in terms of investment, it gets counted in terms of jobs, it gets counted in all kinds of ways. But the ecological devastation that may or may not occur is simply off the ledger. We don't measure it. We measure it in all kinds of abstract ideas, this is bad or this is problematic, but it doesn't show up in any national ledgers. Even more than that, the GDP does not count distribution. It says nothing about the distribution of wealth, and that is one of the prime failings of economic measurements or econometrics of our time, which is to say that, for example, if the 6 of us up here, I could say that our average income was $50,000 a year. That may or may not be true. Let's say $50,000. But it doesn't say, for example, it doesn't mention that Ross over there is actually a billionaire, and the rest of us over here are only making a couple $1,000s a year. If you measure it out, it looks like we're all making about 50 grand a year, but it says nothing about inequality. More than that, even one more step about when we talk about economic rationalities and economic measuring capacities, is that the best thing for me to do leaving this event would be to drive my car and get into a car crash after this event. If I were to go home and walk home, that does nothing for the economy. That does absolutely nothing. It gets recorded nowhere. There's maybe a little bit of depreciation on my shoes. If I were to ride my bike home, that helps a little bit because there's a little bit of activity happening. If I were to drive my car, that's actually very helpful to the economy because there's going to be some kind of economic activity happening. There's going to be insurance, there's going to be gas, there's going to be a little bit of depreciation in the car. But really the thing I really should do to help this economy out is to drive my car home and get in a car crash. There are a fantastic number of economic exchanges that happen and will get recorded, from the insurance to the cops to the paramedics to the auto body, et cetera, et cetera. But to your mind, that makes no sense at all. That's a crazy talk. And what that suggests to me then is that the way we think about economics and the way we measure it have a tremendous amount of incapacity, a tremendous amount of constructiveness, and a considerable amount of blindness imposed on it. And those particular sets of constructions are inscribed in the way we, and when I say we, I mean me, tend to think about economics. And when I tend to think about what constitute a new economics, I find it increasingly difficult to think outside economic rationalities that have been handed down to me for the last 2.5 centuries. And I found this particularly noticeably recently. Am and Joe, a buddy of ours, we just traveled up to Fort Mac just out of curiosity to the heart of the tar sands. And we traveled up there just to kind of check it out. I won't burden you with too much of it, but to say that the tar sands are kind of what you think they are. They do kind of look like that. And they are all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that we heard said over and over again, repeatedly, was, well, we're just not going to leave the oil's there. We're just not going to leave it in the ground. That was it. I was like, well, I mean, you could. You could, but that's killing me, man. The stopwatch is pounding down. What do you want? One. Thank you.
We're going to cover a little bit of the panel.
Yeah, I got it. No, I got it. Thank you, sir. So a huge part of that then for me was to be able to think about, and honestly, when people said to me, the oil's in the ground, we're not just going to leave it there, the reality was that I just didn't have a very good answer. I could come up with something, which was like, yeah, maybe you leave it there, but then what about those people's jobs? What about all the economic activity that is all the multipliers that are coming out of the tar sands that are really at the heart of Canadian prosperity right now? And I really struggled for different ways to think about it. I will cut it short on this to say that Em and Joe and I we traveled through to Lubicon territory, which is about 8 hours to the west of that, to see a 500-person indigenous nation fighting desperately, clawing for the last couple hundred years, fighting against the oil and gas industry, fighting against the provincial and national governments, but more than anything, fighting against economic rationalities, that there is oil and gas on their land, and that it's worth so much that they have to leave it, and trying to find ways to talk around that. And I think listening to Lubicon folk talk for a couple of days, I recognize the failure that I have to be able to listen clearly so often, in particular to Indigenous folks around here and Indigenous folks that we work with. But more than anything, for me, the failure that I have endemically to be able to listen to other kinds of rationalities, that I find myself groping to try to think in new ways and to think of new kinds of languages, to think about new kinds of ideas. And that's where I guess I would say that work like Marilou's and artists like many of you in the audience are so important, which is to somehow stimulate, somehow jog us, somehow intervene in the ways that we presume that economics works. Because the idea that has been handed down to us for the last 400 years is that economics is a science. It is like weather. You can talk about it, you can maybe analyze it, you can measure it, but it's a given. And I think that more than anything, the thing that when we talk about new economies or talk about a solidarity economy or talking about something like alternatives to the economy, is that we have to understand that economics is not like gravity. It is not handed to us. This is not like the weather that we just have to manage. That is a constructed idea, and it's been constructed out of particular kinds of ideas, particular kinds of subjectivities, and particular kinds of intentions, and that we can think outside of it. Frankly speaking, I don't really know how, except to say that the only thing that gives me comfort is to try to return to words and ideas that matter to me. Ideas like friendship, like neighborliness, ideas like hospitality and generosity, and then try to think about what that might look in my everyday life outside of economic logics. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We have, I think, a perfect segue here to Cedric, and I actually experienced Cedric's work before I met him, running around the streets of Montreal with a bunch of other people who, unless you were plugged into the same song, you wouldn't realize that we were listening to this silent disco, and we're in fact part of a silent disco squad. And that's a taste of, I think, the beauty that Cedric puts into the world. So without much further ado, I'll continue to introduce him. Involved in a flurry of activities like 101 Day in this silent disco squad. He's working on an MA in human systems intervention from Concordia, and of all people to show us how we might think with respect to alternatives to this economic rationality, I give you Cedric.
Do you have the slides? Okay, I can. Ross will give it around for you. Okay, good. Well, thanks. That was a beautiful introduction. I'll open it by saying that when I was invited to do this panel, I felt a little bit like an imposter. I don't necessarily consider myself and thinking about what I do in terms of economics. I'm not really in the arts either. I'm kind of here because I think we're trying to do something different. I don't share the same language that Matt has, which, and I understand as I hear you, might actually be a chance for me. Because I don't feel like I'm stuck. I don't feel like I like I just do those things. I don't. Anyways, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background of what 101 Day is about, and thinking about the topic, I realized that maybe what we've been prototyping with this is what I call an economy of generosity. And this is not like I didn't come up with this. It gradually emerged in our conversations as we were creating this project. And as I was invited, I also I looked the word economy. What does it actually mean? And I believe the first thing that pops up when you look on the internet is that economy comes from eco, which is the home. So economy is managing the home originally in its most simple form. And so I think to a certain extent that's what we try to do here, is try to see, come up with a project that would be a prototype of a different way of managing our home. And by our home, I mean our city. 101 Days is really about the city. And it's about what would happen if we all decided to take back the city the same day. And what would happen if we decided to experience the city as commons? We hear a lot about, I mean, the past 150 years have been branded as the tragedy of the commons, mostly. And what we see, or what I hear bubbling at the surface since a few years, is this idea of starting to reclaim the commons. And in this, we're inspired by other cultures, we're inspired by history, and I think there's just a taste to just try new things and just try. And the last question we ask with 101 Days is, how do we work together? How can we try to work together to create the city of our dreams? And that is a big endeavor. So I'll leave it at that for now. So I'm going to try a little exercise with you guys. I would like you to close your eyes, please. And picture that you have a magic wand in your right hand. And with this magic wand, you could give any gift you want to your city. It's really about the gift. And the question would be like, what would that gift be? So we won't get to share our gifts necessarily. I think it's sometimes deeply personal, and we're not in a 101-day workshop here, but I'll still share mine. So the gift that I wanted to give to my city through this project was a vision. And it's the vision of the city as a place for connection and a place for relationships. It's the vision of the city as to a certain extent, a social body, and something that has its own intelligence and its own creativity. And something that is also generative of change. When we think about the economy and the state of the planet, nowadays, I think 75 to 80% of people worldwide live in cities. So I think we can fairly, say that it would be fair to say that it's the major challenge of our lifetime. So we need to reinvent ways to live in our cities and to live together in our cities and live consciously in our cities. What do I mean by living consciously in our cities? We see it, it's very easy to get lost in the rat race and just not pay attention to what's going on around you. And the idea behind 101 Day is precisely that, to kind of like disrupt that everydayness, that rat race, to learn to see again the gifts. And the craziness. There's a lot of craziness, I believe, in those pictures. So my gift was offering this vision, and most importantly, calling others to play with it. So 101 Day, like what is it very, objectively? It's 100 actions that would happen the same day in your city and the idea is to make the city better, to create the city of your dreams. So you come up with a dream, you come up with a gift, something you want to do, and you don't just sit on it, you actually act it. And you offer it to the city. In all its humility, its riskiness, you dare to do something that you don't necessarily do every day. And it's a practice of humanity It's relearning what it means to be a human being in a city and to enter in relationships with other human beings. It's a practice of generosity. We do this for no other purpose than to seed some beauty and some grace and reinvest that in our daily lives. And just sharing what we have to give, which is sometimes the dream is the best part of who you are, right? So that's that. And in doing that, what we experience, what we wanna experience is a shift towards what we call an active citizenship. And what is an active citizenship? I guess it's several things, and I don't necessarily have like a fixed definition of what active citizenship is. It's this notion of being able to live creatively in your city, and also it links to this notion that we have a very narrow, as you know, you said we tend to have a very narrow vision of economics. We also have a very narrow vision of citizenship, and I'm a systems practitioner. I believe that everything is linked. We believe that citizenship is voting every 4 years. And that's what you're told. I'm originally French. When I started this project, I was not even a Canadian citizen. And often, when I would go to my family and my in-laws and starting to have political-oriented conversations, they would be like, "Well, you don't even vote, so why do you bother?" And my stance has always been like, well, there has to be something more than that. There has to be more ways to get involved in our cities and in our life as citizens. So we tend to think that every 4 years, that's when you express your citizenship. Oh man, okay. And then most of us actually don't vote. I mean, probably in this room, like a majority of you do, but you see like participation rates in elections are dropping, and and it creates this situation where we're governed by people who don't really have the democratic legitimacy to make choices in our name. So, anyways, that is active citizenship. Active citizenship is a way to reinvest that part of life, which is really what we call the cité, as opposed to the city. The city as a set of infrastructure and as a set of institutions, as we experience it in North America, we can I think it would be fair to say that it's thriving. What is really at risk is the cité, as a community of human beings living together and realizing that they have potential to actually move things. So that's what we want to take care of. So when we do an intervention, just to go back to that, we start with the dream, we start with the invitation, and that's the first part of that active citizenship practice. We dare to name it, to act on it, to open it to the world. And then we also play. We play this game called Being Yourself. Play this game called Being Yourself, play in the city. And in this, we're very much inspired by how children actually experience the space. I don't know if some of you have kids. I do. They've been my best teachers about how to experience the city. If you try to convince a child that this chair is not a pirate ship, well, good luck. I've tried that with I don't try that with my 4-year-old. I kind of play along because she's taught me that anything is possible if you dare and if you believe. So that's that. I'm going to close soon because I'm being nudged, but I just want to say a few words about the impact of this. Because that's a question that we're asked very often. Okay, so you have these really cute interventions and it's and it makes people feel good for a day, but what's really the core of it? What does it change? And I really don't have a good answer for that. I know what it changed in me, and I know what it changed in other people. What it changed in me, and it changed in other people that I've worked with, is that it changed our way of seeing the city. And I think it changed the narrative, the story that we tell ourselves about what it means. It's not my job to do this. It's the city. I don't have the right to do this. Why should I paint bike lanes in my street? I can't do this. I'm going to be fined. So this narrative of, what we can do or what we can't do. And mostly it's an entry point, I think. We do this one day a year. Like we've done that 2 times in Montreal. We're doing this next week in partnership with Silent Disco. There's 101 day next week in Vancouver, in case you didn't know about it. I don't know. Type up one, it's on June the 6th. So, please do something. What it is an entry point from a practice of the exceptional to what we call reconquering the everyday. If I can do this one day, that means I can do this every day. That means I can improvise in my city every day. I can change the way I interact with people. And this is really pretty much what has happened to me. I became way more playful. And it's very fun, actually. It's just, when you start seeing the city like that. So, it's transferring from the extraordinary to the ordinary. And that's the entry point that we propose. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Cedric. Our final panelist's name is Todd Lester. He's known to some of you, I know. So Todd is an artist and cultural producer who's dedicated his career to supporting and enabling socially engaged artists around the world. He is a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and founder of both the Free Dimensional and Lentionnet.org. Now, Todd is one of the individuals that believes most in the power and the importance of artists to shape the vision of the direction of society. This project, the Artist Roundtable, was very much born out of Todd's imagination. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over, and thank you very much. Todd, I'm going to give you this really oppressive clock so that you can self-regulate and I don't need to nudge you.
Is it about 7 minutes?
About 7 minutes,
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe nudge me when I'm getting close. I'm afraid it'll distract me.
Great.
And Ross, the pictures are just for the first half of what I'm going to read, and then I'll... Hi, everybody. My name is Todd.
Todd, I'll just get you to mic yourself. You can choose a color. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Todd. Sorry if I've had my back to some of you this morning. I was also organizing my thoughts. Thank you for having me. I'm going to let that slide a little bit, Scott. You said socially engaged artists, and to be frank, I really like working with artists in general. I'm one of those people that would argue that we don't need to call a dog a barking dog, and often we don't need to call artists social artists. I'm going to read a little bit to you, and then I'm going to give a little bit of a meditation that I've been thinking as others have been speaking. I'm talking to you this morning about a project that I'm co-making in Sao Paulo that's called lanchonete.org, or lanchonnet.org. The lanchonete is the ubiquitous lunch counter that is on almost every street corner in populous cities and even in rural areas throughout Brazil. It may well be one of the remaining sites of cross-class consumption in that vast country. Lanchonnet.org is an arts-based approach imbued with a community organizing ethos that supports and amplifies citizens working for a just city. Lanchonnet.org believes that characteristics of a just city are attainable, yet enjoying the right to the city is not a static thing and may never be fully arrived at without incremental and new outside-the-box approaches. Lanchonnet is particularly focused on the center of Sao Paulo, and through its specificity examples a methodology for other cities and contexts. It attempts to pilot an atypical organizational form, a cluster of associated people and organizations working together, members that don't all have the same objectives but share some basic values about and aspirations for the city. It is both an association and a physical space, a platform and a restaurant. It is made up of people, just like the city, and there are about 25 of us. I'm only going to read a little bit longer, then I'll break it up a little bit. While operating as a lunch counter or a popular restaurant places a particular focus on food and nutrition and hospitality, these limited topics provide the ballast for understanding and discussing the cumulative causality of class and labor on urban daily life in the surging city. And in its role as a platform, Lanchonete offers lanchonetchi is about whatever is put upon it by local folks. Therefore, cultivating, conveying, practicing, and exempling its durable and flexible usage is how we fill our days. We recently made a project on water, which the city, unfortunately, is running out of. As I've explained, the food of it is both actual and somewhat a trope. While we love food and understand its relation to rights, labor, and daily life, we also want to be careful in how we deploy and encourage its discourse. We now know that food speak is easily subsumed or co-opted by the narrative of our hungry market and unfettered capitalism, and that foodie culture within the broader neoliberal project is regularly a part of pricing people out of neighborhoods where they have made their homes at the micro level, while agropolitics at the macro level is the staging ground for colonization 2.0. Therefore, we are very cautious in how we make our food. Okay, now the time for a little bit of a meditation, which is really fresh from hearing everyone speak. And I'll also, time check, do I have 3? Okay. I'll also say that a few weeks ago I was in Beirut, and I'm really touched by, and will continue to be, the physical signs of warfare, which amounts to Syrians really on almost every street corner, sleeping, begging, etc. Hence, the meditation that I've come up with today is in relation to rights and the new economy. But also it's in relation to the city as a space where I'm excited to be an avid explorer. I'd like to complicate a little bit this thing that's called the sharing economy and the pop, which often means dominant culture in relation to commodification. I think about, I was in the car this morning, we were talking about bike sharing and how there used to be here, and now, I think there's bike sharing in Vancouver. I just think we talk about bike sharing sometimes in this new form that is the large banks subsidizing bikes so that they have these mobile billboards. And I just made a list quickly of how the things that are actually sharing are so swiftly commodified, and yet we still sometimes mistakenly refer to the new commodified forms as the sharing forms. Bike sharing, bank billboards, hosting, such as couch surfing, now Airbnb, street art, moving into corporate signage, street performance, moving into game show type, like America's Top Talent, Top Model, et cetera, and something that I'm thinking about a lot lately, the necessity of, say, ethnic enclaves in our cities producing food, which is a lead-in to some of the food cart hype that we see in many of the major cities, while simultaneously the sale of food informally becomes illegal. I think a lot these days about what Henri Lefebvre talked about in his Right to the City, and also what some smart folks who I've been reading are now suggesting has been appropriated in a bourgeois way. In fact, in one of his last essays, Henri Lefebvre talked about how he knew that this right to the city, which was very much a Marxist idea that he had, was being co-opted. And he said, if an idea no longer works, just give it to the enemy, by which he meant capitalism will co-opt this idea. I'm thinking about the nation state becoming the city, or vice versa, in the face of the death throes, literally, that the military-industrial complex is yet able to wield. And I'll close with just a rundown of our generation of rights, and that's what I wanted to kind of riff on. We have 2 recognized generations of rights. That's political civil, and the second is economic, social, and cultural. The political civil came in the mid-century, last century, then it was bifurcated in the 60s. And there is another idea of rights, which is self-determination, group, and collective rights, but this has not gained the seal of approval by some of the large Western states. And I was thinking about why that is. Now that the corporation can enjoy the rights of an individual, we know exactly the source of the obtuseness exhibited when the West claims it difficult to render individual and collective rights simultaneously justiciable. And therefore, some of the things we see when we see, well, tens of thousands of people drowning at sea each year when they strike out on boats to get to economic opportunity, we see the collision of what is a globalized economy that supersedes the state in some ways, yet not the most important ways, with still a very rigid visa regime. And I think I'll close, if I may, with a very short quote by Hannah Arendt. She says that citizenship is the right to have rights. And then a quick example from a researcher, Adrian Lahoud, who I heard speak last week in Beirut. He said two things. He gave us the example of Sudanese representative to the climate negotiations in Copenhagen some years back, arguing that what would happen if these policies that were seemingly progressive, seemingly acceptable, would go into effect, that you would effectively have climate genocide, that the countries who could barter and trade their pollution via carbon credits would simply be enacting or continuing a status quo. And he also said something very specific about Beirut, where we were sitting for these discussions. He said, what is so very dismal about this 4-year war is that it will end when the construction industries are ready for it to end. And that you can tell that by seeing the railroad projects that will touch both Syrian borders from the Emirates and from Beirut. And that when those train lines are planned out and all of the commodity or monetization of those routes can be seen, planned for, that then this war will end.
Thanks, Todd. Marilou, does something come up for you, that question? The relationship between your work and systems change?
I would say first the idea of a system for me is, I think about it in a way that's a little bit maybe complex, that I think, for example, the economy is not one system. It's a set of practices, tools, regulations, laws, ways of feeling, moving, doing things. So it's an incredibly complex net of things that are always changing and that are always being maintained and transformed and oriented by humans. And I think that's how I approach this question in my work and looking at small fragments of this.
Anyone else?
I think it's a really good, complicated question, and thank you for asking it. I think what I'm trying to acknowledge in my thinking and in my work is that there's not an us and the system. We are the system. So, and this is the trick. If we want to change it, then we have to change ourselves. So there's an inner dimension of change and of like changing our practices and or the way we reflect, the way we mirror the world. And there's not a single answer to that. There's many answers to that. And so that's what I would offer. And even in like the diversity of work that's around the table, I think that's also what we see. There's all those ways to really kind of massage the same seed. I don't know how to name it, other than it's a seed of something that's shifting.
Hi, so I was wondering if we could just, a little bit of a follow-up on that, and talk about how our economic culture, so GDP, how that might present barriers or restrictions on us to participate as citizens in a cité. That makes sense.
Matt, I'm looking to you for this one. Do you have a sense of the question?
You asking me?
Go for it.
No, I don't have a sense of the question. Can you ask it again, sir?
Yeah, so like how the growth of our economic culture being presented as GDP is something that we all sort of ingrain as like, oh, I want to participate in society, I'm going to go buy something. So how does that interact with how we might, use events like 101 Day to stimulate economic growth, for example? Try and mix those two worlds.
I really don't know how to answer that because I have a really hard time reconciliating 101 Day with this idea of economic growth. For me, and I think for a lot of people who participate actually, in at least the events. The events have a very ephemeral quality to them. And I don't know, I think to a certain extent, the practice that it might lead to, when we talk about, I think it relates to what you Matt, were talking about at the end of our intervention, is about rediscovering values such as generosity, hospitality, things like that, and not in a marketable way, sharing, but not sharing sharing Uber style. It's not, that's not sharing. So I really don't know how to answer your question. I'm going to pass it on to Matt now.
I'm sorry, I passed it over to you because I didn't know how to answer the question either. Sorry, bud. Except to say, I think there's something, maybe I'm intuiting it incorrectly here, but there's something that there's a thread in here about the way that certain kinds of ideas, even kind of really interesting and really thoughtful and really caring ideas, become subsumed into logics of commodification so easily. And I heard you speaking of that easily. And so even I can't remember which one of you boys, but one of you said something like the $100 billion sharing economy. And it sounds like such a tremendous perversion of the idea of sharing, and how easily so many of our ideas, even you're talking about food, can become implements and instruments of displacement. And so it makes many of us feel awkward and reticent and sometimes nihilistic about that kind of activity. If everything becomes part of the 24/7 globalized marketplace so easily and so seamlessly, and everything can be marketed and everything can be sold around us, then how can we act? And so much of that activity, for me, then some of the, and I don't even know if I'm getting close to answering your question there, but some of that too is that ideas of scale, ideas of systematic change then become weapons to be used against us. And I think then, so I guess some of the activities that I feel most proud about and I feel most confident in are ideas that are resolutely non-monetizable, asystematic, and asymmetrical kind of activities. So activities that are simply like giving away food for free, activities that seem to be at the heart of human value systems, almost universally, although I'm extremely reticent about using that. But the idea of simply sharing a meal with somebody else strikes me as somewhat resilient to the idea of monetization. And I think that carving out those places in our lives seem to me, in some ways, and I'm super suspicious of even ideas like participation. Certain kinds of platforms inherit certain kinds of participations, and I want to ask who's participating and why and in what, and what kinds of activities are we being asked to participate in. And I think that I guess the only answer I got for you here is that there should be we should feel confident in our ability to try new things and suspicious of our own motives.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think a continuation of those thoughts kind of leads into my question or just comment for response. But when you were talking about the different sharing economies and the $1 billion sharing economy, and then you mentioned all of these examples, bike sharing, the local food provider turning into a food truck. And I think, well, what's causing that is lots of people liking it, lots of people thinking it's great, and then the kind of mechanics of our world and the paradigms that we just kind of have been ingrained into us about how the world works is that when something then moves to mass appeal, it just forms this big weight of we want this, and then that weight shifts so perfectly into the hole that is automatically spilt for it, which is the capitalist underpinnings or the way, it should be then sold, it should be bought, and then we lose these things to this, this end result where it's been absorbed by something that turns it into something entirely different. And I like what you said too. I was listening to a CDC Ideas podcast, and Jordan Peterson, who's a psychologist, was talking about how it's harder to rule oneself than it is to rule the city. And so he said, if you want to change the world, just change yourself, which sounds simple but has systemic change implications. So maybe, yes, when we think, okay, we want this, is that how do we change these good things from being absorbed by this capitalist world? And maybe it's how do we develop the level of an incredible, maybe mental freedom that people need to have or self-awareness to kind of stop ourselves from just instantly giving something over to these this capitalist exchange. We can't stop the mass appeal or stop the drive from people wanting these good things, but why is it that then when it becomes good, can it go somewhere else and still be given away and still have lots of people receive it and be part of our world without it needing to be part of it in like a capitalist exchange system? I don't know if there's a question there or a comment.
Had a question? Any responses?
I'll respond to this. What I find interesting is that when I was sharing here, one of the things that emerged from this discussion with Cedric, for me it was this aspiration towards something that would be common, that I found that many of the speakers pointed towards that direction and coming from very different points, but that there was this aspiration. And I think some of what you're talking about is that aspiration of like finding a way to define commons and to create commons that would not be appropriated And I think that's definitely a challenge that I see each one of us looking at and thinking about in different ways and acting upon also, which is important. So there's all these levels of reflection, finding language, finding new language, and finding new practices, and probably also, like you mentioned, the question of rights or institutions, finding ways to maybe institute other forms of property that would permit these things to actually be shared and not fall into a commodification or private property or even state property.
I just had a question around the problem of scale, and I'm asking this question in terms of in my own work that I've done, both grassroots, very mainstream work in politics, is that one, when you're working at the scale of power and change, it can be so frustrating that one has a tendency of working at a more grassroots level where you have agency and autonomy, and only because you can stay somewhat below the radar and therefore construct things that don't get shut down by power. And at some point, this relationship of scaling up, making systems change, when you have urgent issues like climate change, the whole piece of urgency gets thrown in. And I'm wondering, and this is to any of you, how you deal with the problem or grapple with the issue of scale in your work in terms of the relationship to systems change.
We have another question, Alyssa at the back, and then see your hand up there, so we don't have to get too tight. Got it. The relationship between scale and your work.
It's a hell of a question. Yeah, it's a good question. Can we take another question and think on that?
That's a great idea. Alyssa.
I wanted to say thanks to all the speakers. It's been a really fascinating panel so far. And I have a question for Marilou. I want to go back to these humble expressions that you've been developing with Richard. I really see the work as an exploration of not economizing and taking risks with yourself and with fragility as well. And inhabiting the office space in really unusual ways is one example of that. And then this revaluing of useful and useless movements, sort of like the sawing of the bag of water, creating a value that wasn't previously there. These really beautiful gestures that are actually quite strange to look at seem to work outside of a system. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you developed an economy of movement or unlearn the economy's effects on your own body to move against it. If you can talk about how you internalized that as an individual and then worked out some of those things.
Yeah, thank you for the reading into the work and your question. I think one of the things I find interesting in sitting next to Matt is that much of my development in thinking about economy comes from looking at the same language that he so aptly described and the kind of frustration and limitation and criticism that you can have looking at this conventional economic language. And also working in the field of art and trying to find ways in art first to work in a less rigid way, work in a way that allows for a chance, for uncertainty, and for opening new possibilities instead of working only from a critical perspective, which is a little bit where I started in terms of identification and perspective. And so trying to create these spaces for exploration. And I found that to work on certain ideas, the best way for me to do this was to work physically and to work in a way that definitely the physical, the body and the mind are not separated. I think that's a very old and erroneous conception of the body. It's not one that I share. And so trying to work with the body and the mind in doing and then trying to feel
things differently and trying to, it's that part of the work on the self, also that Cedric was talking about, and trying to see how you can feel things differently and unlearn certain ways of feeling and doing things, but doing it in a way that there is this encounter between the limits of the body, where you actually learn about your body, its limits, what it can do, what it can't do, and also you learn about the materiality of the world. So there's this encounter with other forces. It can be the will of other people, and it can be objects, spaces, and so working in this very material, corporal way, but usually working in attention with specific ideas. And I don't know if Justine, who's sitting at the back and who's a practitioner and somebody very conscious about body and movement, would like to add something to this, because she worked with us on the project. Is there anything left to be done at all? And she was actually had so many precise ways of describing what she was doing and how she was approaching the difficult question that we put upon her of doing things in an unproductive manner without doing nothing.
Now my heart's like, there's one physical response immediately. I think it's just something about paying attention to how, first of all, like Marilou said, just really paying attention to how you're using your body, but also paying attention to how your body's been socialized. So we have this idea of agency, but if we're not always thinking about how we're actually moving through the city or coming into contact with people, or how we're actually using, there's so much embedded narrative in gesture that if we're not being responsible for that, or using some sort of awareness of that, that's where we can sort of take a certain kind of responsibility. And I'm trying to remember, I think it's so many things in that residency, and I think the thing that I took from that time with you guys is that what was most important is that I can have interest in things without having to get anything back.
I also remember when you would stop doing something because you'd say, I'm bored with it.
Yeah.
I just want to stop.
Yeah, I don't care anymore. And that's fine. And that's something about changing our minds, about how we're moving through making work or making dance or making choreography, or, you know, it's fine for it to become for it to want to do something else. And I think there is this idea that we can work with when we're working, which is something else is always happening. So we can be in exploration of, like, always seeking that somehow. But I think there is something about paying attention to how we use our bodies in space in terms of generosity, and these beautiful things that have been said today: hospitality, generosity, friendship. My goodness, this is a way we can extend our bodies into those ideas.
I think you just added something, because I said you were bored with, so you would stop doing something, but that was not the word you used. It was care. You didn't care, so you stopped. And I think that's the other word that maybe hasn't been really brought out today, is that attention to caring about what we do, and maybe not doing the things that we don't care about.
Hey again, everybody. I didn't tell you before that I'm jet lagged and warn you of the rambling that sometimes ensues. But so let me say what's on my paper before it gets out of my head. The two questions I was thinking: the scale of our work, our artistic practices, and then also scale as commodity, which is something that I feel like you were saying. What I think about those two things together, and I think first and foremost, I think that we're at war. We are at war. And some of the ways that our states send war and destruction into other places cannot be divorced, as in neoliberal policy, from some of the urban policies that come back to things that pertain to, say, the citizen's dignity. So let me give the examples to sort of articulate that. One of the reasons I started thinking about ethnic produced food as a necessity, so that if you're a new arriving immigrant and you need to work informally in order to survive, maybe you draw on your ability to cook your own food. This, in many cities, becomes illegal if you don't have the right license, while at the very same moment that cultural reference is commodified into a kimchi taco cart, let's say. I like kimchi tacos. I'm not I'm not hating on the food. I'm just saying that while the cultural reference can be illegal, and the commodity of it goes on without the culture of the person who has the reference benefiting always. And I saw this first on when I saw a New York City police officer emptying the food cart, a shopping cart of a woman in Queens, and you know, so there was a real, not just telling her not to do it, but being very undignified in the way of doing so. Now, if I were to attach that to, say, warfare, for example, we have, and I'm blanking on his name, but the Iraqi artist, he teaches at NYU, and I just can't remember, but his brother died in the Iraq, in one of the wars that the US led in that geography, and so he started tattooing little dots for all the casualties in his hometown on his back. And so I started thinking, well, you know, it's a good thing that he has that outlet as an artist and he can somehow process that, because, you know, the other outlets we start to see in Boston, Texas, Paris, and recent attacks, that what I'm trying to paint, the picture I'm trying to paint for you is that it's not just the us and them of we're here and they're there. It is the people who now make our cities, our co-citizens, who, you know, are not, you know, maybe they haven't just had the food dumped out of their cart, maybe their brother has died, maybe their mother has died. And so that we're going to start feeling these relationships of these neoliberal ways of power and control more and more, I would argue. And then I'll give you kind of an upside to that you have in a country like Ecuador. Now again, Ecuador is not the leading country of the West power-wise, let's say, but you have this move to give a right to nature. So you would say then that was first, second, third, fourth generation rights. But what's so important about that, and I'll go back to a comment I made about the tens of thousands of people dying at sea, the relationship I'm trying to make is that when you run out of options at home, because someone has either sent warfare your way to, you know, as a guise to take away natural resources, or you're just in a tangential territory where it's not warfare, but still the trade agreements mean that you also don't have work. Where you could look is to nature, to say that there's a right to the nature and maybe the micro commodity that would benefit you with employment locally. So there are some solutions. They're just going to be obfuscated by, I guess, the powers that are. And then I wanted to lastly close that statement with what are these neoliberal urban policies called? In New York City, it's called quality of life enforcement. Now, doesn't that sound sweet? Quality of life enforcement is code word for broken windows policing. This is a global ideology of policing. But, I mean, this is where we get someone strangled to death for selling single cigarettes in New York. This is how it happens. There are policies that can be interpreted at a level, and then that becomes the racism. But it's not, again, it's akin to the very racism that has, you know, disaffected people blowing up news outlets in Paris, marathons in Boston, and most recently the Free Expression Conference in Texas.
Have I got time to answer a question? I'll defer to,
A brief response.
Sure. This is a non-response, actually. It's just a continuation of a long conversation. There's two things that I would just want to say about your question about scale, which I feel like has been addressed in a number of ways. The first one is something I want to think about. I want to figure out how to think better about humility. It's really easy for someone like me, like a white dude, to start thinking about a little idea that I have, maybe just screwing around with my kids, and then think about how to make it bigger, and how to make it national, how to make it international, and that somehow that jumping scales makes it more relevant. And in a time of planetary size eco-disasters, it's easy to think that we have to think at scale for it to matter more, and I'm not sure that's true. And I think to think about that as a white guy on unceded indigenous land, I think is particularly problematic in terms of trying to understand my own particular lacks of humility in that regard. Secondly, I would just say very briefly is that I would say maybe the biggest lie of late capitalism is the idea of scarcity. That every single conceit of high modernism, of growth, of progress, of development are contingent on the notion of scarcity. And I would just suggest that maybe that we are actually enough, that we actually do have enough.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I was looking forward to hearing what you had to ask. If folks want to come up and speak to the panel afterwards, I think that would be okay. So this is the end of our 2-hour session. Thank you all so much for coming. When we were asked to do this project, and we'd settled on the new economy as the topic, we went to Google, we went to Wikipedia, and we found that the first time the new economy had kind of found its way into the public consciousness was Tomorrow, 32 years ago. So it's in this Time magazine article, cover article, an interesting 12-page article that goes through what technology promises and how it's going to disrupt and how it's going to change, and how the entrepreneur is going to be this vector of the new world that we're going to see. And reading through it, some of it is quite dated and quite hilarious, but most of it is quite familiar. It lines up very closely with what we hear today in descriptions of what Uber is going to do and what Airbnb is going to do. And what struck Ross and I about that is that throughout these different cycles, as the new economy has permuted meaning and changed, the underlying paradigm has stayed relatively the same. The companies have changed, the technologies have changed, what it looks like, the design has changed, but underneath it lies the very same paradigm. And so the root of our question here is, if we are headed in the wrong direction and we need to shift course, how do we change it at the paradigm level? And the goal of the Artist Roundtable, and the goal of this broader project, is to bring artists on, because artists are very, very, very good at taking that perspective and questioning at the root level what our paradigms are and how they could change. So I hope that our official artists, but also our non-official artists on the panel, were able to provide that. But most importantly, it's not just the realm of the artists. To question those paradigms is something that we can do every day through investigating ourselves in economic relations with others and with the material world. To ask ourselves, how am I experiencing this? What does this mean? But more importantly, imagining how could this be different. So I hope that you can take that going forward, feel some inspiration from the artists, and share with your friends. Thank you.
This Artist Roundtable experiment is larger than this one iteration. Todd has been a large force in creating this kind of open platform, and as well the Lou Lamaze group, who Sean is representing here, and perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about what's in the works.
So thanks to all of you, and especially to Scott and Ross for taking on this platform and developing this iteration and an upcoming one in Toronto later this year, dates and people to be determined and all that. So Musagetes is interested in this approach. It came up actually about a year ago in a conversation with Todd. Todd's been thinking about open source conference technologies for quite a long time, and had this imagination for how to set artists in conversations and in relation to experts in all sorts of different fields. Thinking about the arts, of course, as not existing in a little bubble. So for Musagetes, with a mandate to make the arts more central and meaningful in people's lives and in our communities and societies, this made a lot of sense. And it also made a lot of sense within the frame of a national initiative called Cities for People that we've been involved with. There are 4 themes of Cities for People. One of those is art and society, and one of those is the new economy. So we've been super happy to be partnering also with One Earth. Wave, Vanessa. There you go. Everybody knows Vanessa. And of course, Lindsay. Thank you so much as well for being so essential to the development of this. And One Earth has been the curator for the New Economies theme. So the 2 themes worked together to present this Artist Roundtable, and we think that it's been great and successful, and we hope to also hear back from all of you, your comments and such on how we can continue to develop and evolve this model and see future iterations. It's meant to be open source, it's meant to be flexible, adaptable, and stealable for many other forums and so on. I think there are probably quite a number of thank yous as well. I want to thank Am for giving us SFU Woodwards and for collaborating so well on the development of this and getting people out. Thank you. So with that, thank you to everyone, and I'll pass it back to you, Ross.
Thank you, Sean. The thank yous really have been said, of course, to the panel, to the land that we're on, to all of you for being here, and perhaps to add a little continuity to this narrative, and perhaps it's a narrative that could continue beyond these walls. We started by giving gifts. We gave you balloons or sewing needles, depending on what time period you come from. And gifts are a funny thing. A balloon could be a weapon. It could go down a bird's throat, or it could be a miracle for a small child. That needle could similarly operate on both sides of that spectrum. It could fix your broken shoe or your pants. It could also damage somebody. So be conscious of the gifts that you've received and consider how you might give them as a way to carry on this panel and this dialogue that really is really just the beginning here, and it's been going on for longer than we truly know. With that, Scott, do you have a gift for the panel?
Yes. Yeah, so we struggled with what kind of gift is appropriate in the new economy. So we decided to give you something. So here's something for you, and there's something for you, and something for you, and Todd, there's something for you. So please enjoy.
Thanks, everybody. One last note, Sean mentioned that we're very interested in learning from your experience, and one way that you can do that is on the back of the curatorial statement. There's room to write your remarks and insight that you might be taking away, and things we could do differently next time. Of course, we're open to chatting, so feel free to connect in person as well. Thank you. Okay, so I noticed some people are ready to share their thoughts. So turn to the person beside you. They may have a balloon, you may have a pin. Don't fret. You don't need to necessarily bring those two objects together, but bring your minds together and share what's been coming up for you. So I'm going to interrupt these conversations that are emerging, and I'm glad to hear how much thought there is to share. And so if... All right, you guys can come to the round table. We'll listen to you. Thanks, everyone. So if out of these dialogues a question has emerged, simply raise your hand, I'll bring you a mic, and perhaps you could direct it to someone specifically on the panel, and we'll have an opportunity for folks to respond. Yes?
So perhaps you could talk, anyone who feels like it, about the connection between systems change and the work you're doing.
Anyone feel inspired?
Well,
Todd.
this is me because I have just one more thing to say, getting to say it. No, but I'd like to do that, and I'll take just 2 minutes to do so. This is a quote from Saskia Sassen's Expulsions. From finance to mining, the complex types of knowledge and technology we have come to admire are used too often in ways that produce elementary brutalities. These have evolved into predatory formations, assemblages of knowledge, interest, and outcomes that go beyond a firm's or an individual's or a government's project. One thing that we're doing, we're looking for a restaurant space in Sao Paulo. And as you might imagine, to be speculative would not be the goal of our project, and we have to be very careful. So we're working hand in hand with a housing occupation, decades-old housing movement in Sao Paulo, and they are trying their best to use one of these predatory formations, which is the state housing policy, Minha Casa Minha Vida, which is totally corrupt, and I can tell you why later, but they're trying to use it to actually purchase the building that they've been occupying for the last 4 years. We are holding steady with them in the prospect of renting, once it is purchased, the downstairs vacant restaurant that would also be open. And that's one of the ways where we're not in a hurry to open the restaurant, because we think holding steady with them would actually be the way to go for our overall objective.
Thanks, Matt.